So, if you were to take some regular television viewers from the 1950s and show them an episode of Game of Thrones, they would probably have a heart attack. This is because in the 1950s, television content was much more moral, much more wholesome. Things that were considered indecent in the 1950s would definitely not be considered indecent today. And these changes in the portrayal of sex on American television are directly influenced by the viewpoints we as the American public have in everyday life. And these views that we have are directly influenced by social movements that occur in different decades. So from the strict censorship of the 1950s and the 1960s to the sexual revolution of the 1970s, to the conservative Reagan administration in the 80s and 90s, to the cable networks we have today in the 2000s and 2010s, it's obvious that viewpoints about the portrayal of sex on television has changed drastically over time. So like I said, in the 1950s and 1960s, there was a very wholesome moral approach to television. And this was because this was before a lot of social movements had occurred in society. The gay rights movement hadn't started, the civil rights movement hadn't started, so it was unheard of to see interracial couples or homosexual couples on television. Additionally, an article called Regulating Television from the site Exploring U.S. History states that television broadcasters operated under the authority of the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission. In the 1950s, as today, the FCC also prohibited obscene and indecent material. So for example, what was considered indecent in 1950s was a married couple sharing the same bed. So on a show like I Love Lucy, married couples had individual beds. Same thing with the Dick Van Dyke Show, married couple, individual beds. And we can see that this was normal for the time because this was before social movements had occurred. However, a Harvard Law review of the book entitled See No Evil, The Backstage Battle Over Sex and Violence in Television states that by the late 1960s, the disparity between the real world of war, student revolt, and racial conflict, and television's world of talking horses, bottle genies, and hillbilly millionaires became too grating even for the network executives. So we move into the 1970s. This is when social movements started, the gay rights movement, the women's liberation movement, civil rights movement, and additionally, more effective birth control was being created. And as a result of all of these things, the censorship laws on television started to become more liberal. So in Alana Levine's book, Wallowing in Sex, The New Sexual Culture of 1970s American Television, she writes, television offered its viewers a picture of sex and the new sexual culture in which teenagers had sexual desires and experiences, in which women took on conventionally masculine roles, in which gay characters and themes found tentative acceptance, in which sexual violence could be discussed and debated. And here are some examples of that. In All in the Family, there was a very prominent gay character. In the TV show Maude, the main character decides to get an abortion. The Mary Tyler Moore Show was very feminist and progressive when it came to women's rights. And All My Children had the first legal abortion in the early 70s. So as a continuation from the 70s, the 1980s and 1990s came with more sexual exploitation because of the proliferation of cable networks. So cable networks narrowcasted their programs, which meant they targeted specific audiences. And according to an encyclopedia of television entry entitled Censorship, to compete with the viewing audience that increasingly turned to the cable television channels, the broadcast networks have loosened restrictions on programming content, enabling them to include partial nudity, somewhat graphic violence, and the use of coarse language. So you can see that things on television were getting more sexual, more progressive, but because the 1980s and 1990s were a more conservative time, people had problems with this. So John Samach in his book Censoring and Sex, A Historical Journey Through American Media pointed out that the conservative social and political swing introduced by the Reagan administration gave these critics a more prominent platform. They called for more censorship, they called for more regulation about the TV shows that had been increasingly deregulated since the sexual revolution of the 1970s. So with this came more trepidation toward homosexuality on television, as well as other themes that people found to be more lewd. However, again, change in belief, change in attitudes. During the late 1990s, there were some episodes on television shows that showed that people were becoming more progressive once again when it came to homosexuality. For example, on the show Picket Fences, two young girls were shown kissing. On the show Roseanne, the main character, Roseanne, kissed another woman, and this is one of the highest rated episodes of the television show. And as we all know, Ellen DeGeneres came out of the closet when she was the main character on a very popular sitcom, Ellen. So moving into modern times, the 2000s and 2010s, we can see that there was more progressive with homosexuality in addition to more exploration when it came to sexual content. And cable networks came back into play during this time, during our modern time. There were censorship laws that were put into place in the 1990s, but more freedom came after these censorship laws. And the way these cable networks worked is subscribers had to pay money to watch the networks. So these networks knew that they had to distinguish themselves from regular broadcast networks if they were to remain viable and to continue charging people for their content. So an article from the magazine Nerve entitled "Why Censoring Sex Changed Television for the Better" states that the depiction of sex wasn't just a reason for viewers to enjoy the program. It was also a marker of subscription TV's singularity. And we can see that very blatantly in the shows that we often watch and love today. For example, The Walking Dead, Game of Thrones, Orange is the New Black, and American Horror Story. Each of these shows comes from a cable television network, which allows them to show more sexually explicit and more lewd content. But you can see that our ideas and our views have changed significantly because these are some of the most popular television shows that are playing right now. So, in conclusion, the meaning of indecency has changed very drastically over time, from married couples not being able to share beds in the 1950s to some of the stuff that you see on shows like Game of Thrones today. It's just very obvious that our changing attitudes as Americans are directly reflected in the changing sexual displays that you see on television. So, where will the portrayal of sex on television go next? It's up to us to decide. Thank you.